In this video, I'm going to look at a game I played a couple of Saturdays ago in a county match against Surrey. The match was played at the Surrey home venue in Cheam. I was on board 4. I had the white pieces and was up against Nigel Povah. I started with e4 and play went c5, the Sicilian defence, knight f3, knight c6, and instead of d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, the open Sicilian, which is the traditional main line, I played bishop b5, the Rossolimo variation, which I have been playing and studying recently. Now, Black's most popular response to bishop b5 is g6. His second most popular is e6, and his third most popular is d6. My opponent chose the fourth most popular move, knight f6, which is a perfectly logical way of developing. Now, it has to be said that it had been a little while since I'd looked at the theory of this line from White's perspective, and so I had to think quite hard to decide exactly how to play against this move. As it happened, I have been looking at this line for Black recently, but unfortunately my opponent didn't go down the line that I had been studying from the other side of the board, so I was very much on my own from an early stage in this game. Now, what I did know is in this position, White's three main moves in order of popularity are knight c3, simply defending the pawn on e4, the aggressive thrust e5, and bishop takes c6, which is a possibility for White in many Rossolimo lines. White is here aiming for the superior pawn structure in exchange for the bishop pair. Now, I decided to play knight c3 since I felt that this was the line about which I knew the most. However, the move that I had been studying for Black was g6, which is Black's second most popular move in this position, and my opponent instead played queen c7, Black's most popular move, and something which I had looked at, but a while back, and I was struggling to remember how to play against it. Now, I was pretty sure that castles was the most common move here, and the move that was recommended in the sources that I've been looking at. But the thing was that after the response knight d4, Black has some nasty threats. The main threat being knight g4, followed by knight takes f3 check and queen takes h2 mate. And I wasn't really sure how White should counter this. Now, if White knows what he's doing, then this shouldn't be a problem. But unfortunately, I didn't know what I was doing. And instead of castles, I settled on the move queen e2, which is actually rather interesting, at least if it's followed up properly. My opponent responded with the natural knight d4, and after knight takes d4, c takes d4, I had the opportunity to play e5, which seems to be White's best here. Now, Black's most accurate response seems to be d takes c3. If knight g8, then knight d5, queen b8, c3, attacking the pawn on d4, e6, knight f4, knight e7, b3, a6, bishop d3, knight c6, defending the pawn on d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, queen e4, knight c6, bishop b2 is an example of how play might develop. White is certainly better here as he has the more active position, and black's development is not at the moment particularly good. Instead of knight g8, another possibility was knight g4, but then white can simply play queen takes g4, d takes c3, d takes c3, and after queen takes e5 check, bishop e2. And this looks preferable for white, again on account of his superior development. Now, after the best move, d takes c3, e takes f6, black really has to play c takes d2 check. If instead he plays c takes b2, then bishop takes b2, g takes f6, bishop takes f6, exploiting the pin on the e file, is quite obviously very good for him. And g takes f6, d takes c3 is also pretty good for white. After c takes d2, check, bishop takes d2, g takes f6, castles, white has obvious compensation because of black's lack of development. Anyway, e5 is what I should have played, but instead I played knight d5, which is not the right way to go as it gives black a chance to grab a pawn. Now, after the immediate queen takes c2, white has definite compensation for the pawn after knight takes f6 check. For instance, g takes f6, castles, or e takes f6, e5. So black should, and did, play knight takes d5 first. And after e takes d5, queen takes c2 is definitely worth considering for black. It is not clear that white gets enough compensation. I had planned d6, but e6, targeting the weak pawn on d6, is very good for black. Instead, white should play something like bishop d3, but after queen c5, bishop e4, the position is rather murky for both sides. White seems to retain some pressure, but black's position remains solid, and he is a pawn up after all. Anyway, black preferred the more solid g6, getting on with his development, and after castles, here he definitely couldn't take on c2 because of the obvious queen e5 forking d4 and h8. So instead he played the natural developing move bishop g7. And now rook e1 looks slightly better for white due to his pressure on the black position, although black remains solid. Instead he played the natural looking d3, although this does break the coordination between the queen on e2 and bishop on b5, which allows black to play queen c5, beginning to put pressure on white's d5 pawn. Play went bishop c2, b5. Black is intending to simply take the pawn on d5 by, after the bishop retreats, bishop b7, followed by bishop takes d5. Now, White played the natural, bishop b3, but here he missed a tactical blow that maintains a balanced position for him, and this is the move b4. Now, the point of this move is that after queen takes b4, white plays a4, and after, for instance, b takes c4, white plays bishop a3, and the queen cannot move because of the mate on e7. Indeed, none of black's possible 13th moves offer an adequate defence against bishop a3. So instead of queen takes b4, which is definitely a blunder, black should play queen d6, and then play might go bishop takes b5, bishop b7, and now rook e1, putting pressure on e7, and black obviously shouldn't take the pawn on d5 with the queen takes d5, apparently threatening a mate on g2, but overlooking queen takes e7, and white has a mate of his own, which is one move quicker. So instead of queen takes d5, black should play bishop takes d5. And after bishop f4, queen e6, play is probably about balanced here. Anyway, white failed to notice the possibility of b4 and instead played the natural bishop b3. But now black starts to get some unpleasant pressure on the white d5 pawn. First he castles, and after bishop f4, developing white's last minor piece to an active square, black continued bishop b7, hitting d5. Now, white decided to play the active rook on f to e1, hitting the e7 pawn, but probably the more defensive queen f3 was the best way to go, although black is still definitely for choice here. After rook on f to e1, black missed a chance. Now, bishop takes d5 just leads to an exchange of pawns and equality after bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes e7. But e5 was a more active way to defend the e-pawn than the move played in the game, which was to move the rook on a8 to e8. Black gives up on winning the d-pawn, but instead becomes extremely active. Bishop takes e5 is not possible because of rook on f to e8, winning a piece due to the pin. So white would probably have to play d takes e6, but after f takes e6, black's position is clearly better. Anyway, rather than e5, black chose the more solid but passive rook on a to e8. Now, queen f3 was again probably white's best choice here, but he preferred a more active course and played bishop e5, which is tempting but wrong. Black has a choice of good continuations here. bishop takes e5 seems a bit unnatural to a human exchanging off the strong bishop on g7, but white cannot exploit this, while black will soon round up the d-pawn. Queen takes e5, and now f6 is not advisable on account of d6 check winning the black queen. Instead, d6 is obviously stronger, and now after queen g5, black's best move is e5. During the game I considered f6, and I had analysed queen h6, bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, rook e4, but then f5 is very good for black. However, instead of queen h6, queen g4 is better, and after bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5 check, queen takes d5, rook e6, white has, I think, obvious compensation for the pawn. Anyway, rather than f6, e5 is rather stronger, because d takes e6 is not possible on account of queen takes g5, and e takes f7 check, which seems like it might be a clever retort, fails to king h8, as white cannot capture on e8. For instance, f takes e8, queen, queen takes g2, mate. So instead of taking on e6, white would have to play something like h4, but then after bishop takes d5, black is just a pawn up. White is not going anywhere on the king side. Anyway, so that was a possibility that was worth considering, but black instead chose to play f6, which is a more natural move for a human to play. After d6 check, e6, white has to retreat the bishop on e5. One possibility was bishop f4, and this is perhaps a marginally better square for the white bishop, but black is still on top. Anyway, instead of bishop f4, white chose bishop g3. Now, black decided to play king h8, preparing e5, but it gives white some extra time, which he uses to offer an interesting pawn sacrifice. Instead of the slow king h8, black could have chosen the more direct a5, which creates definite problems for white. The immediate threat is a4, winning the bishop on b3. Now, a3 is met by a4, bishop a2, bishop h6, preventing rook c1, and preparing a subsequent black assault on the weak c2 square. Instead of a3, white could play a4, but then b4 stops c3 by white, and white still has numerous problems. Black is still threatening to round up the pawn on d6 by playing king h8, followed by e5 and queen takes d6. Another possibility would be to play bishop h6 to control the c1 square to prevent white playing rook on a to c1, and then looking perhaps to attack down the c file, putting pressure on c2 and removing the bishop on b3 with bishop d5. So, in short, black would have plenty of possibilities after the direct a5. However, he chose king h8, which was the first of a series of slightly inferior moves which allowed white to generate some very good counterplay. White now played c3, offering a pawn in exchange for seizing the c-file, followed by placing a rook on c7. I think this was a very strong practical move, and it seemed not to have been anticipated by black. Now, black took on c3, but instead bishop h6 would have been very strong, preventing white from playing a rook to c1, which is at the heart of his attempts to gain counterplay. However, as I said, black took on c3, d takes c3, and after b takes c3, again he could have played bishop h6, which wasn't quite as strong this time, but would still have been better than the move that he played in the game, which was queen takes c3, accepting the pawn sacrifice. But after rook on a to c1, queen d4, rook c7, white now has definite compensation for the pawn with his active rook. Black played the natural bishop c6, and now white came up with a very strong move. Queen e3. This is a little surprising, as white is a pawn down, but the black queen is a far better piece than the white queen, and exchanging them leaves white with the better placed pieces. As a result, white has definite compensation for the pawn. Play went queen takes e3, and now white had to take with the pawn, f takes e3, because rook takes e3 would have been strongly met by either e5 or f5. After f takes e3, black looked to create counterplay on the queen side with a5, also incidentally taking his a pawn out of immediate danger of capture. White played rook c1, and black continued with the natural a4. If e5 instead, blocking the bishop on g3 out of the game, white could have played a strong exchange sacrifice, rook on 1 takes c6. As we shall see, this possibility turns up in a number of variations. Here it looks a pretty decent try for white. After d takes c6, d7, rook b8, d4, a4, bishop d1, intending to reroute the bishop to f3, where it eyes the pawn on c6. Here, white has a good compensation for the exchange, but probably not more. Anyway, instead of e5, black played the more obvious a4, and white responded with bishop d1, which opens up the possibility of bishop f3, followed by taking on c6. Now, here, black had to be careful because there were several ways to go wrong. For instance, black could play bishop d5, looking to take the pawn on a2, followed by advancing the a and b pawns. However, after rook takes d7, bishop takes a2, rook on c to e7, the white rooks on the 7th rank are obviously far too strong. This is just winning for white. Instead of bishop d5, rook c8 was a tempting possibility, challenging the strong rook on c7. And now the exchange sacrifice, rook on 1 takes c6, is not as good because of d takes c6, d7, and rather than rook takes c7, bishop takes c7, when black cannot prevent d8 queening the pawn, rook on c to d8 instead is perfectly solid, and black is fine here. The position is probably about balanced. However, here, rather than the exchange sacrifice on c6, white could play the simple bishop f3, and black doesn't have a decent response here. For instance, bishop takes f3 is just met by rook takes c8, obviously winning. Rook takes c7, d takes c7, bishop takes f3 is met by c8, queening the pawn, which again is an obvious win. And if, instead of bishop takes f3 or rook takes c7, black plays rook on c to d8, then bishop takes c6, d takes c6, rook on 1 takes c6 is obviously crushing for white. The d pawn should decide things. So those are some possibilities that black had to avoid. Instead of bishop d5 or rook c8, he played the stronger e5, looking to block the bishop on g3 out of the game, and perhaps go after the pawn on d6. Here, white went for a strong regrouping manoeuvre, bishop e1. Now, white would ideally like to play both bishop b4 and bishop f3, bringing his bishops to very strong squares. Now, rook c8 would again be an error, because now the exchange sacrifice does work. Rook on 1 takes c6, d takes c6, and now rook takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop a5, and black cannot prevent white from playing d7, d8, queening the pawn. So instead of rook c8, black played the rather more solid rook b8, perhaps looking to advance his queenside pawns. White continued with bishop b4, blockading the pawns and supporting the pawn on d6. Now, black could have remained solid but passive with something like rook on f to d8, when white could look to improve his position in various ways. He definitely has compensation for his pawn, but not necessarily any more than that at the moment. However, black plumped for a more active move in the form of f5. And now white decided it was finally time to attempt a breakthrough and played rook on 1 takes c6. And after d takes c6, d7, black has to be very careful. Now, in this position, bishop f6 at once is the more accurate move order. When bishop takes f8, there's nothing better than taking back the exchange. Rook takes f8, rook takes c6, king g7, transposes to the game after move 32. The point is that after the game move, rook on b to d8, white now had a chance to get a big advantage with bishop f3, e4, bishop takes f8, bishop takes f8, d takes e4, b4, e5, and the soon-to-be connected white passed pawns are very difficult for black to deal with. The only possible factor in black's favour is the opposite colour bishops. Anyway, white didn't take that opportunity and instead played bishop e7, and black correctly played bishop f6, which is an important defensive move as it means that black retains sufficient control over the d8 square. Play went bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, rook takes c6. And now king g8 would be a blunder because of rook takes f6, rook takes f6, d8, queening the pawn. But this is rather obvious, and black instead played king g7 so that rook takes f6 could be met by king takes f6. This is incidentally the position that would have been reached after the superior move order on move 29. Now, both sides were starting to get rather short of time here, particularly black. So white was looking for ways to set practical problems because he couldn't see that objectively he had more than a draw here, but it was certainly worth trying to get more. So rook b6, rook d8, rook b7. Now white realizes that he's probably going to lose the pawn on d7 and hopes to pick up the black A and B pawns in return, and then his A pawn would give him some sort of practical chances. But there is the additional issue that the white pawn on d3 is rather weak, which means that black will be able to pick up not only the pawn on d7 but the d3 pawn as well if this exchanging operation occurred. Now here black should have played bishop e7, which supports putting his queenside pawns on dark squares where they would be safely defended, and then white really would have nothing here. But instead he played king f7, which is a natural looking move, aiming to rush over to win the pawn on d7. But here white did have the possibility of actually preserving his d7 pawn with bishop f3 and, for instance, b4, bishop c6, b3 a takes b3, a takes b3, rook takes b3. Although one suspects that the opposite colour bishops would still mean that this ought to be drawn. But it should at least have been tried by white. However, instead, white played king f2. He was fixated on trying to defend the d3 pawn so that the exchange of his d7 pawn for black's queenside pawns would leave him a pawn up. But he's just too slow to pull this off. King went, black went king e6. White tried rook b6 check, and black had to keep the bishop on f6 covered. He couldn't take on d7 at once with the king because of rook takes f6, so he played king e7. And now white acknowledged that the time had come to perform the exchanging operation. So he played rook takes b5. But after rook takes d7, it's obvious that he's just too slow to carry it out fully successfully. So, for instance, bishop takes a4 is met by rook takes d3, and black will be able to target the pawn on e3. So this should be a draw. And in the game he played king e2 instead, covering d3 and threatening bishop takes a4. And black played rook a7, defending the a4 pawn. Now, white could have tried a3, looking to fix the black a pawn on a4 so that it could be won by rook b4 and rook takes a4, but this would end up leaving the white pawn on a3, which is on a dark square, too vulnerable. For instance, king f7, rook b4, bishop e7, rook takes a4, rook takes a4, bishop takes a4, bishop takes a3 with an obvious draw. So white tried rook b4, but black played a3. Now his a pawn is a lot safer because it's on a dark square. And after bishop b3, king f8, rook b6, king g7, black offered a draw which white accepted. Even though black was very short of time indeed at this point, white could see no sensible way of setting him any sort of practical difficulties, and so thought this was the best time to call it a day.